Okay, for our presentation this evening, we are honoured with the presence of Simon Harrap, who lives in North Norfolk. Um, I would like to introduce him. He and his wife have gardens, a small plant nursery, and some meadows and wet woodland totaling about 8 acres in North Norfolk. They also have the National Collection of Hardy Dwarf Gunnera. Simon has always been interested in natural history, starting with birds, for which he has co-written or co-written several books. Until 2014, he led field meetings about them in the Philippines, Borneo, Malaya, India, Nepal, Madagascar, and South Africa, amongst other destinations. I'm grateful to him for providing that information for me. He's more recently done a lot of work with plants, and together with Anne, has authored the best-selling Orchids of Britain and Ireland, a field and site guide. And he's just published a field guide to the wildflowers of Britain and Ireland, an excellent book for folk trying to get to grip on the British flora. And it it looks like this. I can't get. So I'm trying to show you a copy, but the video is not working properly.
It's
Okay.
tricky.
Anyway,
It's tricky with your background, I think. But yeah, we got a glimpse of it.
it,
Thanks, John.
it's very good. Um, an excellent book for folk trying to get a grip on the British flora. It covers the majority of it, although it excludes grasses, sedges, rushes, and ferns, as these are best left until you're more familiar with the easier groups and with botanical terminology. Simon is a keen photo Simon is a keen photographer, and each plant is accompanied by a photograph that he has taken of the plant in its natural habitat. As anyone who's tried to construct even a small system for identifying a group of plants will know how difficult it can be. So Simon's presentation, planning a user-friendly wildflower guide, should be an eye-opener. So, okay, Simon, thank you. I'll hand over to you.
Right, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me along to talk to you this evening. Um, I'm going to talk to you about the process that I had to go through in order to produce the book that I wrote, the Wildflower Guide, called Harrap's Wildflowers. I should say that the title might sound a little bit conceited, but there were so many variations on a field guide to the plants of Britain and plants of Britain and Ireland, etc., etc. I just wanted to do something that was a little bit distinctive and would stick in people's minds, and they would actually recognize when they saw it as being what it was. So, anyway, as a teenager, I was obsessed with wildlife, and I must admit that I considered field guides to be basically the equivalent of the word of God. They were inscribed on tablets of stone and brought down to the masses, and the people that wrote them were probably almost superhuman. In my teens, I had two books which I use reasonably regularly: The Birds of Britain and Europe by Heinzel, Fitter and Parslow, and The Wildflowers of Britain and Europe by Fitter and Marjorie Blamey. And these were almost my constant companions, I must admit, especially the bird book. And they were, at their time, I think they were very good field guides. It's notable that Richard Fitter was author of both of them, and he must really have been a great naturalist. And they taught me a lot, it has to be said. But I really wanted to learn the name of the plants that I saw around me. And I was lucky enough in some cases to actually see some special plants. I remember quite vividly being shown Herb Paris in a wood in Worcestershire near where I lived. I was ushered in to see it by some elderly ladies. But I did have a problem, and that was that I didn't have anybody to mentor me. I really didn't have anybody to hand who could help me identifying plants. And the literature in the 1970s was relatively limited. So I struggled. And as a result of that struggle, I was seduced by birds. Um, Fortunately, I recovered in the end. So now I'm approaching old age. I'm still obsessed with wildlife, and I wanted to produce the field guide to wildflowers that I would have enjoyed, that I would have found useful when I was a teenager. And so in 2025, there is a much wider choice of literature for the budding botanist. So I had to do something that was a little bit different. And not to mention, of course, the internet. And I think now is really the moment to mention the elephant in the room, which is, our field guides redundant? Are books redundant? Why not just go out and use an app, which are easily and freely available? I've considered this quite carefully, and I've come up with some reasons why apps are not the answer. First of all, at the moment, field guides and other literature are more reliable if used carefully. This, of course, may change. AI and machine learning is progressing all the time, and I can well see a situation where it would be as accurate as the most skilled botanist in many cases. Using a field guide, however, requires you to actually look at the plant in front of you. You've got to touch it in many cases, and you can smell it, and it's a real thing. And by touching and smelling and feeling it, you're engaging with it, which is much better than getting out your phone, taking a picture and tapping a few keys on the keyboard to get an answer. Another thing about field guides and books in general is they do give you much more of a context for what you're seeing. If you open the page of the book with the plant that you've identified, you'll find its relatives and lookalikes around it on the pages before and after, and you'll be able to read about the habitat and maybe the conservation status and maybe see a range map. So you've much more immediately got a context for what you're seeing. And I also think actually browsing a field guide is not only fun, it's educational. When I was young, we used to sit on the bus with a couple of my mates when we went bird watching, and we'd go through that Heinzel, Fitter and Parslow book with a fine-tooth comb, and we'd be dreaming of seeing things like grey hypercoleus in the Middle East, not thinking that we ever would, but we were just excited to see that these things existed. And that process actually helped us to learn an awful lot about the birds, and to a lesser extent at the time of the flowers, that we might or might not see. So all in all, I think that a field guide gives you a much richer learning experience. And really satisfied that I was going to be doing something worthwhile, I started work. Now, I quickly realised that a lot of thought is needed to produce a good field guide. A lot of decisions have to be made. And the first decision, and probably the most important decision, is who is it for? Who is the audience? Who are you writing it for? Because that's going to directly affect what you put in the book and how you present it and many other things. So Harrap's Wildflowers is principally aimed at beginners and improvers. That's people who want to name the wild plants that they see around them. They want that name to be correct. They're concerned that it's going to be right. And they also want to expand their knowledge. So they want to add to the number of plants that they can recognize as they're going about their business. So here we have a spread from the book, and you can see that if you were just a sort of casual observer of plants, you might think there's one red poppy, but with a little effort, you can then see that there are 5 species of red poppy that you should be looking out for, and they're not difficult to separate. Some, obviously, corn poppy is very common. Some of the others are rather scarce. 1 or 2 are declining and near threatened or vulnerable. And the book, in theory, is giving you all the information in a clear way for you to be able to go out as a beginner, as somebody who has no great specialist knowledge, and identify these plants. But it didn't really stop there, because I wanted the book to be useful to more knowledgeable botanists as well. People who might want a portable illustrated reference, a sort of aid memoir, something that they can take around with them, and if they see something interesting and they just need to check up on a couple of details, they can refer to. So here we have another spread, and on it we've got the ramping fumitories, which are a very attractive group of plants, but they are relatively similar to each other and can be a little bit confusing, and some of them can be a little bit tricky to identify. So I try to put all the information that you would need to make a diagnosis in there on that page, on that spread, so that people can go out, refer to this and say, oh yes, I need to look at the sepals, that's the important thing, or I need to look at the upper petal and whether it's got a broad white rim, etc., etc. And so hopefully it's all there, self-explanatory, just what you need to know. But not just that, I also wanted it to be an attractive book and a pleasure to handle for anyone who enjoys the browsing text and photographs about British wildflowers, both the common ones and the rare ones. So here's a spread of saxifrages, and this includes some plants which many people may never see in Britain. Tufted and drooping saxifrage are extremely rare. They're very localized. You're only likely to see them really if you've got a pretty good idea of where to go to look. But it's nice to know that they're there. I think it's nice to know that these plants are part of the British flora. And I think particularly in these days when we're told time and time again how nature deficient Britain is, it's actually quite nice to remind people that there is still a lot out there that's worth looking at. So that's the target audience. But going back to the beginners and improvers, I asked myself also a question: why do so few people go beyond the casual enjoyment of things like bluebells and poppies? So everybody likes to have a walk in the woods in springtime, and bluebell woods can be quite popular, can even be crowded in some places on a nice day in May. And at least here in Norfolk, we still have fairly good populations of poppies, and some fields can be red almost with poppies in the summertime, and people will stop their cars and they'll have a look and they'll take photographs, and they're really enjoying these wildflowers, but they don't go further. It seems to be quite uncommon that people take their interest any further than something very casual. So I thought, what discourages people? What's putting them off? Why is it difficult? And what do I need to do to actually mitigate this, to enable them to get past these barriers that there might be to participating more deeply in botany? And I came up a list of things which actually are problematic in my experience. Running through them quickly, there are lots of plants. And secondly, skilled, in inverted commas, botanists use scientific rather than English names. Botanists use obscure jargon. And the final point is skilled, again, in inverted commas, botanists prefer keys. So let's take those one by one. There are a lot of plants, and indeed there are. The Atlas 2020 includes a total of 2,405 species, and they're not including the microspecies in that total. The majority of them are actually native to Britain, and there are quite a lot are ancient introductions, so-called archaeophytes, and a significant number are so-called neophytes, that species introduced to Britain after AD 1500. So that's a lot of plants to cover. And here, just as an example, we've got one of my favourite species. This is night flowering catchfly. It's an ancient introduction, probably brought to Britain by the first farmers in their seed corn. And it's one of the 152 archaeophytes which are really treated as honorary natives. So no portable illustrated guide can cover 2,405 species. The book would either have to be huge, to do it justice, or you'd have to have microscopic pictures and tiny text, and it'd be very impractical. So that means choices will have to be made about what to include. Moving on to the second point, the use of scientific rather than English names. Now, I'm sure that people may have noticed, but there is a real snobbery about using scientific names. It makes you a serious botanist and not just a dabbler. And I may have a slight prejudice about this because I endured a Latin O-level at school. And so I've got a bit of experience of having to listen to Latin, and of course all scientific names are just Latinized, but the majority I think are not based on Latin. But that's a real issue for lots of people, because if the name is essentially completely meaningless, it's more difficult to remember and a real barrier. And this is almost enshrined in the botanical hierarchy, because the BSBI skills pyramid, that's the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland skills pyramid, puts you on level 2 or level 3 if you use common names, level 4 if you mostly use scientific names, but to attain the dizzy heights of level 5, you should always use scientific names. For birds, butterflies, dragonflies, and most moths in Britain, almost everyone uses English names, and they seem to do just fine. And ironically, biologists and lichenologists have gone to some lengths to invent English names for their subject, because they want to make them more accessible to more people and share their enthusiasm with more people. And they recognize the importance of English names in that. So here we have Dianthus gratianopolitanus, which sounds like a dish in an Italian restaurant, or to you and me, cheddar pink. And I'm sure most people, the general public, would relate far better to cheddar pink than to the scientific name. Next point, botanists love jargon. And of course, some jargon is essential, as it allows a short but very precise way of describing plants. And words like petal, sepal, calyx, corolla, etc. can't be replaced by anything. And if you're interested in plants and you're interested in identifying plants, the fact is you have to learn that jargon. You have to learn what it means, and you have to be very familiar with it. But quite a lot of jargon is not really necessary. Here you have an oak leaf, and at the bottom you have what a botanist might call a petiole, and what most people would just call a leaf stalk. And if you look in the glossary of a book and you look up what petiole means, it means leaf stalk. So my argument would be, why not say leaf stalk? Because you're instantly making your text more accessible to more people. And some jargon is actually so obscure that few, if any, botanists know what it means, and they have to look it up in the glossary at the back of the book. And one of my favourite examples of this is a word that I came across just once, which is marquescent. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And marquescent means leaves that are dead but remain on the plant through the winter. And the point is that it is a shortcut to a way of saying that. But if it's such an obscure term that you have to look it up in the glossary and it's rarely used, you might as well just put it in the text as it is and save everybody the bother. So, on to perhaps one of the most serious things is botanists are obsessed with keys. And that's even if many experienced botanists, when you actually watch them, don't use the keys very often. And this is a picture of two of the books that really depend on keys. You have The Wildflower Key by Francis Rose, which is a book which many people cut their teeth on and is still popular. And it has illustrations, colour illustrations, but it also has keys. And then on the right, you have, of course, Stace, 4th edition. It's a book with virtually no illustrations, no colour illustrations, and it depends almost entirely on keys. And this sort of would reinforce the point that people like to make, that keys are it and keys is what you should really be using. But if you go back a little bit, you'll find that the book that fired up the enthusiasm of a whole generation of botanists and brought them into the subject full time was this, Keble Martin, the Concise Flora of the British Isles, Concise Flora, which does not have keys. So books and field guides without keys have a long and I think auspicious history. And to think a bit more deeply about keys, for birds and dragonflies and butterflies and moths, just like scientific names, people do without them, and they seem to manage perfectly well. People know the birds of Britain, and Europe. Some people I know almost all the birds in the world, and they would never once have used a key to identify any single one of those. They've just relied upon learning what's in the book, learning the right areas to turn to, learning the families of birds. Don't get me wrong, keys can undoubtedly be very useful, and they're particularly useful in families or genera with lots of rather similar species. So take the umbellifers, this is Alexander's. It's a big group, they all look a bit similar, and a key can be a good way to identify the plant that you're looking at. It's not the best way necessarily, it's not the most accurate way, but it is a shortcut to doing that. Again, with sedges, another big family of fairly similar plants, a key offers a shortcut to actually getting to the right species. But in my experience with people who are not really committed botanists, most of them would absolutely run a mile if they thought that they had to start life as a botanist by using keys and running through keys to identify the plants that they saw around them. And it's worth remembering a few things about keys as well. They started life, I think most of them, in order to identify dried and pressed flowers in herbaria. And they came of age at a time when colour printing was poor or non-existent. And also, keys are easiest to use when they use clear-cut characters. You know, is the plant hairy? Is it hairless? Are the leaves divided? Are the leaves undivided? Once you start getting into having to make judgment calls based upon your experience of that group or that family, that genera, then they start becoming harder to use and probably less reliable. And people say keys work best when you already know the answer. So in Harrop's Wildflowers, when I was planning it, my aim was to be user-friendly and to reduce or remove some of these barriers. How was I going to do this? I was going to have a simple structure. I was going to have minimal abbreviations. I was going to reduce the jargon. I was going to try and have clear illustrations and up-to-date maps. And I was going to select the species that I included relatively carefully and definitely not attempt to cover some of the more difficult groups. And we'll go on to that. So a simple structure. And this may sound very obvious, how to order the species. And that's a decision in itself. A strict taxonomic order, following Stace, probably you could say the most scientific, is not necessarily the most practical way or the most user-friendly to put the plants in the book. Practical, because although I follow Stace, I do have lots of, or a selection of small problematic families with one or two species, which have to be put in out of sequence as the order of the genera within, as in the order of the genera within the families. These changes are to make the plants fit in the book on the right pages, because if you have a family with just one species in it, pardon me, it can throw everything out of kilter if you're trying to fit it in and you're trying to put the right plants on the right pages facing each other. I also grouped trees and larger shrubs together because otherwise they would be scattered through the text, which would be completely baffling for people without a lot of botanical knowledge. So, for example, in Stace, the various families, oaks, family 56, hornbeam, family 59, maples, family 77, limes, family 80. These plants can be dozens of pages away from each other. And if you're faced with a tree, a big, obviously mature tree, and you're trying to identify it, it's completely puzzling to have to go through the entire book to locate the trees. I also put aquatic plants together, and I have to say, and I have to admit, these groupings are arbitrary, because what counts as a larger shrub or an aquatic plant is not always clear cut. So it is somewhat arbitrary, but I do the best that I can in the circumstances. And as well as the conventional index, I also have what I call the pictorial index on the end papers, which is a small thumbnail photograph of a typical representative of a particular genus or family with the page reference. And this isn't meant to be a key, it's just meant to be an easy way of locating the plants in the book. Although I know a lot of people have told me it's very useful because they can look at this and they can pick out the most likely candidates to explore further. So making life simple, it also includes keeping all the text and illustrations relating to each species in one place. And this may sound incredibly obvious. Of course, you put it in the one place. So here we've got bastard toadflax, and we've got the scientific name, the English name, the distribution maps, the photographs, the text, all together. But it isn't always done that way, and there are some books which have much more complicated structures where bits of text relating to the same species is scattered in 3 or 4 pages. And although they might be nicely cross-referenced, it's actually infuriating to have to keep flicking backwards and forwards in the book to see the various bits relating to the plant that you're looking at or trying to identify. And then you might find that there's overlap in the text, which is wasting space, or that there are actually inconsistencies between them. So I wanted to keep everything together on the same page, easily accessible. Minimize abbreviations. I think that's fairly straightforward. Text heavy with complicated sets of abbreviations is difficult to read and difficult to follow. So I just use the very minimum abbreviations possible: millimeter, centimeter, meter, north, south, east, west. Probably that's about it. Reducing jargon. We've covered the problems with jargon already, and I try to reduce the jargon just to the minimum technical terms that I could get away with. Otherwise, I would preferentially use plain English. So I'd have leaf stalk, flower stalk, and one thing that I particularly cut corners on, you could say botanically, was on the fruits or the seed pods of plants, because if you are being very correct and technical, there are many different ways of describing fruits and the structures that surround fruits, but most of these don't mean much to many people, whereas seed or seed pod or fruit is very clear and very easy to relate to. I also wanted to have clear illustrations, and of course that's the backbone of any field guide, good pictures. Many people prefer drawings or paintings, and I can easily see why they would, because in a drawing or a painting you can isolate the features that you want to highlight, you can remove any sort of distracting background, and you can be very clear and precise, especially if you're a brilliant illustrator. These are some of my favourite illustrated books. I think particularly the illustrations by Ian Gerard in The Wildflowers of the British Isles. They're quite possibly some of the best colour illustrations of British wildflowers available anywhere. And I particularly like the Scandinavian book as well, for lots and lots of lovely pictures. And it's not just colour illustrations, which I like and could be useful, black and white. We've got the Drawings of British Plants by Stella Ross Cragg. I'm lucky enough to have a copy of that. It was issued in about 50 parts over 15, 20 years, and they are magnificent. They were very accurate, very beautifully laid out, beautifully designed, and a great help to me because I didn't have easy access to herbarium specimens, but I did have access to drawings very carefully constructed of herbarium specimens and very, very clear. And there are remarkably few errors in these pictures. But top quality artwork needs top quality artists, and it's very expensive to produce, especially nowadays. If you imagine if you were doing paintings for a field guide to British plants, how many weeks, months, or even years it would take you to do that. And that means that essentially publishers are increasingly unwilling to invest in books that do that. They don't want to pay large sums of money upfront for artwork, which they may never recoup on publishing the book. Very sad in many ways, but happily, digital technology has facilitated a massive leap in both the quality of photographs and the quality of printing. So now you're able to get really nice pictures of a whole variety of plants. The digital camera enables you to take loads and loads of pictures. You can check the exposure and the focus on the spot. You can experiment with all sorts of different angles without worrying about the cost of the slides. Many plants are very photogenic, and notably orchids, and people really enjoy taking pictures of them. But for the photographs for the field guide, I had to have pictures of everything, and almost all the photographs in the guide were taken with a view to illustrating a field guide. So as well as orchids, I would have plants which I think almost nobody would point a camera at. Things like this false London rocket. I had to track this down. Happily, my daughter lives in Nottingham, which is one of the centres of its distribution. Track it down and try and get pictures which displayed the features that you would use to identify the plant. And I was quite pleased with the result in this case. Cameras, digital cameras, not only allow you to take lots of pictures of plants, so you've got lots to choose from when you come to lay out the page, but they also allow you to illustrate details. And some cameras now allow you to take astonishingly good close-ups of tiny little details, which can be really useful in identification. So here we've got the seeds of childing and proliferous pink, two really rare plants in Britain, two plants which are only safely distinguished by the sculpturing, the surface appearance of the seeds. And these seeds are tiny. They're possibly about 1 millimeter across. But I was able to take photographs of seeds of both of these, and what was a fairly obscure and difficult to understand written description becomes much clearer when you're able to illustrate it like this. So I was actually very pleased with the end result. Clear, up-to-date maps are really useful. They're really useful to the reader because they're going to give them a really good idea of what they can expect where. Knowing what plants are likely to be around is a big part of the identification process. You know, you wouldn't want to be identifying drooping saxifrage in a wood in Surrey, for example. So up-to-date range maps were a must. Fortunately, I was able to use the maps from the BSBI's atlases. In the case of the first edition of my book, Atlas 2000, the second edition, Atlas 2020. So it's a massive thanks to the BSBI for allowing me to do that. And an even bigger thank you, really, to the many, many people who contributed records, which allowed the BSBI to construct those maps. We'll move on to careful species selection, and we've already said 2,500 nearly plants in Britain. You've got to choose. First of all, grasses, sedges and rushes and ferns. These plants are really a challenge for beginners. Identification rests on very small details in some cases, and you need specialist equipment. For some of them, you need a binocular microscope, really, to be able to identify some of these plants safely. And if I had included them in the book, it would have increased its size by at least 40%. And I think it would have turned it into something unmanageable. And I don't think I would have been able to include enough detail to really allow people to identify these plants with confidence. So in common with many field guides, they are omitted. In an ideal world, for beginners especially, your field guide would only include the plants that they're going to see. It would have no distractions. It'd just be the possibilities where you live. Of course, that is actually an impossible thing to do because the distribution of plants in Britain is so convoluted and interlocking and complicated that it's impossible to single out the common plants of any one region. I think that field guides or pocket guides, which include just a selection of plants, are often merely frustrating because people can't find the plants in it that they're actually seeing commonly around them, because the author has made a choice which is too limited. And even some rare plants people are quite likely to come across. Take Cornish heath, abundant on the Lizard in West Cornwall. It'd be hard to go to the Lizard and have a walk around in the central heaths away from the coast without seeing hundreds or possibly thousands of plants of Cornish heath. But it's nationally rare. It's only found on the Lizard and I think one other site in West Cornwall. Otherwise, it's merely an occasional garden escape. It's a plant which you really would have to include in a field guide to British wildflowers because people are going to come across it. In the second edition of my book, I decided to cover as many of the native wildflowers as I possibly could. It helps to avoid the frustration of trying to identify a plant and find that it's not covered in your field guide. And the other thing I wanted it to do is I wanted it to showcase the richness of the British flora. You may never see a diapensia, you may never be bothered to climb up the mountain near Fort William and track that plant down, but you might read about it somewhere and want to know what it looks like. And I think people just enjoy seeing what's possible, seeing the richness that we actually do have despite all the problems that conservation has in this country. People get hung up nowadays on native versus non-native status in terms of plants, and sometimes quite vehemently hung up about it. The number of native species is by definition almost static, as is the number of honorary natives, which are the archaeophytes, the plants introduced before 1500. But the number of recent introductions, the neophytes, is steadily increasing. And it's important to include those neophytes. They're often quite prominent in urban areas, no area more so than London. But it's not always obvious which ones deserve space in the book and which ones you have to leave out. Some have declined sharply over recent decades. For example, plants bought here in wool shoddy and which was spread on fields as fertilizer. Many of those have almost disappeared, whereas others are very recent arrivals and spreading rapidly. So we don't have space to include all of them, but we do have to include some of the things that people are likely to come across, and we have to choose. Things that have spread recently, particularly problematic. Here we've got narrow-leaved ragwort. This has been recorded for the first time in Britain, really, I think, quite recently, but it's spread very rapidly. And it's now common in many areas, and it's a confusion species for several native plants. So undoubtedly, we have to include narrow-leaved ragwort. Forked catchfly, another look-alike for a native plant, in this case white campion. There are rather few records of this species, and despite a good scatter appearing in 2023, I judged that might be an atypical year and that possibly it wasn't really justifiable to include it in the book, so I excluded it. It's a judgment call. I might be proved wrong. Probably will be proved wrong. Moving on, panicled widowherb. Again, a very recent colonist, but it's locally abundant already and it spreads along roads and it gets into brownfield sites. Seems very likely to me to increase and spread further, so I included it in the book. So that's the native and non-native conundrum. Then we go on to the difficult groups. And a big part of the species selection is evaluating what's it possible to identify accurately using a field guide. So using the limited amount of space that you've got in a field guide, and what you cannot identify accurately unless you've got access to much more extensive specialist literature and a herbarium perhaps, and in-person training or advice. And as well, you've got to have a commitment to intensive study over several seasons to really get to grips with these groups of plants. I feel that if you put in a brief but wholly inadequate text into a book, it can either lead to false positive identifications where people just basically take a plumb at the thing that looks most like it and move on, or it's frustrating when you realize that with the information to hand, the information you've got in front of you, it's just impossible to identify the plants. And these problem groups fall into several very interesting categories. The biggest are the apomictic microspecies, so-called microspecies. They may have constant differences between them, which is not surprising because they're actually clusters of clones, but those differences are often extremely subtle, and identification of all these microspecies, I think, is beyond the scope of any field guide, to be honest, because you just don't have the space and you just don't have the experience to be able to do it. And these include the ladies' mantles, the alchemillas. There are 14 species. They have their own dedicated guide. Brambles, rubus, 334 plus species of brambles. I'm sure we're very familiar with the new guide to Scottish brambles, but they're a tricky group. Rock sea lavenders, the limonium, there's 40 plus species of rock sea lavender. And to be honest, the biggest help that you can have identifying rock sea lavenders in most cases is a road atlas, because you just look to see where you are and then you look up in the book to find out which species occurs on that headland, because it seems to be very arbitrary. Oops. My screen seems to have decided to do something. Oh, here we go. Hawkweeds, 420 plus species, many of them rare, many of them endemic to Britain, many of them very, very localized in Scottish glens. Extremely difficult to separate satisfactorily unless you really do have a reference collection and a lot of experience. The same, I think, goes for dandelions. Despite the fact there's a nice colour guide published 3 or 4 years ago to dandelions, I still think that accurate identification probably requires far more information than you could possibly put into a field guide, and of course far more space than you can allocate to 240 species. We've got the white beams, sorbus, 40 plus species, some of which are confined to just one locality with half a dozen trees. And the elms, where people debate whether there are actually even microspecies. There seems to be a lot of discussion about what the origins of British elms are, how they are related to each other, and the identification of these 62 plus species recently proposed is certainly well outside the remit of the book. So some groups are hard because of hybridization. And these are particularly problematic. You've got the roses, the willows, and the Martian spotted orchids, the dactyriza orchids. Lots and lots of hybrid combinations have been described. You have to be a real expert to identify those hybrids, but the species themselves are often not that difficult to identify when they're in a typical form. So really, I'm only able to allocate the space to identify the species, and I'm not able to discuss the hybrids in any depth at all. So I cover all the native willows and the dactyriza orchids, but only a few of the roses. I think the dog roses are treated briefly because they are really quite difficult. Maybe I'll change my mind next week when I get the new BSBI handbook on roses. Eyebrights, these illustrate a very fascinating problem. The BSBI's Eyebright handbook has got 18 species and 71 hybrids, and they're very, very difficult, I think, to identify, and certainly would be excluded. The species would be excluded. We just have eyebrights as a group. But in an intriguing recent development, I think some research is suggesting that there are only 7 species of eyebright in Britain, not 18. And so that might make things rather simpler, and it might have to be revisited. And then we have cryptic species. We've got to decide whether to include those. And these are things which are very similar to each other and which people have either not separated until recently or still don't really try and separate. The whitlow grasses, people I think don't really try and separate. And the fragrant orchids, until fairly recently, they were all lumped together. They are very similar. They are a bit tricky, but I think it's still possible. Separation is possible if you're careful and you look critically. And so I decided to cover those in full in the book. So here we have hairy and glabrous whitlow grasses. You can see these ones look fairly distinctively different, but I know for certain that hairy whitlow grass is a plant that you have to be really rather careful with, because the common whitlow grass can look extremely similar. And then a final category, which is I call non-species, and this is a particular group, the salicornias, the glassworts, which everybody actually calls samphire, especially if they're talking about it in a culinary context. They're a notoriously difficult group to separate. There's some evidence, I believe, that the plants in any one locality are genetically more closely related to each other than they are to any lookalike plants in a locality 50, 20 miles away along the coast. And so there's probably a lot more to be found out about these, but I did decide to include the species that are described in the literature because they're so obviously different in coloration in the autumn, even if you can't actually be confident about identifying them. So here we have glassworts in September, and we've got the orange and the purplish and the greenish orange, and clearly looking very different, and a trap for people who are going to think, well, why do they look so different? But the book just ignores them. Finally, we have to go on to doing some what I call ground truthing, which is actually checking. You look carefully at the published information, which I did. I look very, very carefully at my sources, and I discovered that even the most authoritative texts are sometimes wrong, and they're often contradictory, or relatively often contradictory, but certainly they're sometimes wrong. So as far as possible, I compared my text with photographs, and I checked the photographs by referring to the standard text, and I tried to resolve all these differences to my satisfaction. Nevertheless, puzzles remained. For example, wild cherry. One authoritative text states not suckering. Another authoritative text states numerous suckers are produced, so wild cherry nearly always occurs as clonal groups of trees. The latter, the second suckering option, is my experience here in Norfolk, and certainly with the one that we planted in our garden, which absolutely suckers terribly. So you've got the species choice, you've got the maps, you've got the photographs, you've got to design the book. The first choice is how big it's going to be. A larger format, a bigger book, offers advantages. You can put more species in it. You can have more detailed text. You can have bigger and therefore clearer illustrations. You can use larger fonts that are easier to read. And at my age, that's a particularly important thing because, like everybody over 45, 46, I'm long-sighted. A smaller font offers a more portable book, and people are more likely to actually take it out and use it if it's small and portable. And it's also likely to be cheaper, so more people are likely to buy it, and therefore it's going to be used more often and be of more benefit. But size, as you would expect, is always a compromise, and the size that we chose, 140 by 216, is a fairly standard size, but I think it's probably about as large as a portable guide can reasonably be. The design and layout I did myself, and that was because I could juggle the text and the pictures around to fit as much as possible in to make everything as clear as possible. If I had to cut text, I knew looking at the page which could be cut often you don't actually have to cut the text, you just have to juggle the words around or put a sentence in a different order, and it'll fit in on the page. And if I had to resize or crop photos, I knew which bits I wanted to cut out. I've been involved in books for nearly 40 years, and I remember the complete palaver of having to go back and forwards to the book designer who's saying, you know, this doesn't fit, can you cut 4 words, etc., etc. And the thought of doing that for 400 odd pages of text was just a nightmare. So I did it myself. And this allowed the available space on each page to be used to maximum advantage. And this, I hope, is a reasonably good example. We've got quite a lot of photos. We've got a close-up photo. We've got some information about the species. We've got the subspecies here of crowberry. We've got the maps. And there's not much blank paper, which is what I really aimed for. I really wanted to use the space as well as I could. So it ended up with 496 pages, 1,225 odd species, 2,600 photos, over 1,000 range maps, and it was published earlier this year, the 2nd edition. And I must say now, despite careful checking, in common with any field guide, there will be errors. There are always errors, and there's always room for improvement. So I would be more than happy to receive any comments or corrections that anybody can make or spot in the text, because if somebody doesn't point them out to me, I might never see them. And there's the cover, which is hopefully nice and eye-catching. Thank you very much.